The laughter started before Eliza Markov set the first post. Two men on a wagon road slowed their horses just long enough to watch her measure the ground, mark 8 points in a rectangle, and begin digging deeper than anyone in that valley had ever dug for a cabin. "You buildin' a cellar or grave?" one of them called out. The other leaned forward in his saddle. "Maybe she's planning to hide from the winter instead of living through it." They laughed. Not cruelly, but not kindly either. The kind of laughter that comes easy when nothing has gone wrong yet. Eliza did not answer. She kept digging. The soil was good, level, firm, exactly the kind of ground everyone else had already built on, which was why they did not understand why she refused to use it. She drove the shovel down again, then deeper, past the depth where most men would have stopped, past the point where the hole stopped making sense. Because she was not digging for a foundation. She was digging for distance. Distance between her home and the one thing no one else in that valley had learned to recognize as a threat, the ground itself. The settlement of Pine Hollow, Colorado Territory, sat in a wide basin surrounded by timber and low ridges that held snow longer than they should have. Most of the men who settled there had come for timber or grazing land. They built their cabins the same way. Logs set directly onto the earth, floors laid tight across beams that rested against soil that froze hard every winter. It was simple, efficient, and familiar, which made it feel correct, even when it wasn't. Eliza Markov arrived in Pine Hollow in the spring of 1879 with a mule, 2 crates of tools, and a habit of noticing things other people ignored. She did not come with plans to change anything. She came because there was land available. But by the end of her first autumn, she had already seen enough to know something about the way people built there did not work as well as they believed it did. She had spent her first winter in a borrowed cabin on the edge of the settlement, a structure no different from the others, logs on earth, fire in the center, heat rising upward, and something else rising from below, cold. Not drifting in from the walls, not pushing through the door, but climbing, steady, unstoppable, through the floor, into the room, into the body. It was not dramatic, not sudden, which made it worse, because it never stopped. She had watched the man who owned that cabin burn wood all night and still wake with frost creeping across the floorboards beneath his bed. She had watched him blame the weather, then the wind, then the wood supply, never once the ground beneath him. She had said nothing then, because she had no place to say it. Now she did, and she intended to build differently. The post holes took longer than they should have, because she was working alone, because she refused to rush, because the ground resisted in ways that forced patience, and because every hole had to be right, not close, right. 8 of them, each 4 feet deep, each wide enough to hold timber thick enough to carry weight without shifting. The settlement watched, not constantly but often enough. Curiosity always returns to what it does not understand. By the end of the first week, they had given her project a name. "Markov's Stilts," one man said at the general store. "Looks like she's building a table big enough to sleep on. Maybe she thinks snow won't find her up there. Or maybe she's just afraid of the dirt." They laughed again, and repeated it often enough that the laughter became expectation. She would fail. That was already decided. The only question was when. Eliza continued. The posts went in during the second week. Thick timber, stripped, dried, burned at the ends before being lowered into place. She used a simple rig of rope and leverage to raise them one at a time. Slow, careful, measured. A mistake at that stage would not be repairable, so she did not make one. When the last post stood upright, rising 4 feet above the ground, the shape of what she was building became visible. And with that visibility came stronger judgment. "You're wasting height," a carpenter named Louis Benton told her one afternoon. "Heat rises. You build higher, you lose it faster." Eliza set her tools down and looked at him for the first time. "Does it rise forever?" she asked. He frowned. "What?" "The heat," she said. "Does it keep rising until it leaves?" He hesitated. "Not exactly." "Then it's not the problem," she said, and returned to her work. Louis stood there a moment longer, then shook his head and walked away, because he did not have an answer that fit what she was building, and without an answer, dismissal was easier. The platform came next. Heavy beams laid across the tops of the posts, then cross beams, then floor planks fitted tight enough to block wind from below. The structure lifted itself above the land, not dramatically, not as something separate, but just enough to change the relationship between the house and the ground. That small distance was everything, even if no one else understood why. From the trail it looked unnatural, a cabin that had not yet been built, resting in the air before its walls existed. "Looks wrong," someone said. "It is wrong," another answered. "That's why no one builds that way." Which was not proof, but it was enough for them. Eliza built the walls without stopping to argue, log by log, measured, sealed, familiar construction on top of an unfamiliar idea. The familiarity made it easier to ignore the difference beneath it. By the time the roof went on, the valley had already made its final judgment. "She'll freeze," someone said, "or starve, or come down and build it properly next year." No one considered the possibility that she had built it properly already. Winter arrived early that year, not violently, not suddenly, but steadily. The first frost held longer than it should have. The first snow did not melt completely. The ground began to harden in ways that made work outside slower, heavier, more deliberate. Eliza moved into the cabin before the deep cold came, because she was ready. Not finished, but ready. The fire lit easily, the heat rose, spread, stayed, and beneath it, something different happened. Or rather, something did not happen. Cold did not climb the same way it had in the cabin she had lived in the year before. It did not press upward through the floor. It did not steal warmth from below, because there was space there now, air. And air did not pull heat the way frozen earth did. The difference was small, at first, barely noticeable. But winter does not test small differences immediately. It waits, it builds, and when it finally arrives in full, it reveals everything that was hidden before. If you've ever seen people laugh at something they don't understand, you already know how this begins. They assume the familiar is correct. They assume difference is failure. They assume experience is enough, until something changes the conditions and forces them to measure results instead of opinions. And in Pine Hollow, that moment was coming. The first hard freeze did not arrive with warning. It came in the night, quiet, unannounced. The kind of cold that does not announce itself with wind or storm, but simply settles into the land and changes everything it touches. By morning, the valley looked the same, snow still thin along the ground, smoke rising from chimneys, men stepping out into the day as they always had. But inside their homes, something had shifted, something they did not yet understand. It began at the floor. Louis Benton noticed it first. He stepped out of bed and felt the cold through his boots before he reached the door. Not surface cold, not the kind that fades as the fire grows. This was deeper, persistent. The kind that seemed to come from beneath the boards rather than from the air. He added wood to the fire, then more. The flames rose, the room warmed, but the floor did not change. It stayed cold, steady, unaffected by what he fed into the hearth. He told himself it would pass, that the first freeze always felt worse than it was, that the cabin just needed time to settle into the season. That explanation carried him through the morning. It did not carry him through the night. Because the cold did not ease, it strengthened, and it did not come from the direction he had always expected. Across the valley, the same thing was happening. Cabin after cabin. The pattern repeated, heat rising from fires, cold rising from below. Men burned more wood, families added blankets. They closed gaps in walls, sealed doors tighter. But the problem was not entering from outside. It was already inside, waiting beneath them. The ground had frozen, and frozen earth did not behave like air. It did not fluctuate. It did not soften. It did not release what it took. It absorbed heat continuously, slowly, completely, and it did not give it back. By the third night, the difference between cabins had become measurable, not in theory, in consumption. Wood piles began to shrink faster than expected. Men who had planned for winter found themselves calculating again, estimating how long their supplies would last under conditions they had not accounted for. The answers were not reassuring. Thomas Hale, whose cabin sat near the creek, woke before dawn to the sound of his youngest child crying. Not loudly, weakly. A thin sound that carried more information than volume ever could. He crossed the room, lifted the child, and felt the cold through the blankets. Not the air, the bed itself, cold rising into the body. He moved the child closer to the fire, added wood, waited. The heat increased, the room warmed, but the place where the child had been lying did not change quickly enough. Because the cold there was not passing through. It was anchored, connected to something larger. He did not sleep again that night. Across the settlement, others reached the same conclusion without using the same words. Something was wrong, not with the weather, with the way they were living in it. They did not say it directly, because saying it would require questioning something they had always accepted. So instead, they adjusted around it. More wood, more effort, more endurance. But endurance has limits, and winter does not negotiate with limits. Eliza Markoff noticed the difference immediately, not because her cabin was warm, because it was stable. The fire did not need constant feeding. The heat did not disappear as quickly as it had the year before. The floor remained cold, but not freezing. The cold did not rise into the space the same way, because it could not. There was distance now, a layer of air between the structure and the frozen ground. That air did not pull heat downward. It slowed the transfer, reduced it, changed the equation entirely. She burned less wood, not dramatically less, but enough to notice. Enough to understand that the difference she had built into the structure was working exactly as intended. She did not speak about it, because she knew how people respond to explanations before they are ready to hear them. They resist. They defend what they already believe. They dismiss what does not match it. So she waited. because winter would do the explaining for her. By the end of the first week, the settlement had changed. The laughter was gone, not replaced with fear, replaced with attention. Men began to notice patterns, which cabins stayed warmer, which required more wood, which families were struggling to maintain even a basic level of comfort. They did not connect it immediately to construction. They blamed supplies, location, wind exposure, anything that allowed them to avoid questioning the structure beneath their feet. But patterns do not remain hidden forever. Louis Benton walked past Eliza's clearing one afternoon on his way back from checking trap lines. Smoke rose from her chimney, steady, consistent. No bursts of heavy burning, no signs of constant adjustment. He stopped, not for long, just enough to notice. Then he kept walking, but he noticed again the next day, and the next, because consistency stands out when everything else fluctuates. By the 10th day of cold, wood consumption had doubled in some homes, tripled in others. Men who had calculated their winter reserves found those calculations failing faster than expected. Not because they had miscounted, because they had misunderstood the problem. The ground beneath their homes was not neutral. It was active. It was removing heat continuously, and no amount of fire could fully compensate for that loss, unless the source of the loss was addressed, which none of them had done, except one. The first person to walk toward Eliza's cabin did not come with questions. He came with observation. Thomas Hale reached the edge of her clearing just before dusk. He did not knock immediately. He stood there, watching the structure, the height, the space beneath it, the ladder leading up to the door. It looked the same as it had before, unnecessary, strange, wrong. But now he was looking at it differently, not as an idea, as a result. He stepped forward and knocked. The door opened almost immediately. Eliza stood there, not surprised, not curious, just present. He hesitated, then spoke. "How much wood are you burning?" She considered the question. "Less than I expected," she said. He nodded slowly, not because he understood why, because the answer matched what he had begun to suspect. He looked down at the space beneath the cabin, then back at her. "The ground," he said. She did not answer immediately. Then she stepped aside. "Come see." He entered and stopped. Not because it was warm, because it was even. No sharp gradients, no cold rising from below, no constant adjustment needed to maintain comfort. Just a space that held its heat without fighting something unseen beneath it. He stood there longer than he intended to, then asked the only question that mattered. "Why?" Eliza looked at the floor, then at him. "Because it isn't touching the ground." He nodded once, not in agreement, in recognition, because he had already felt the difference. He had just not understood it, until now. By the following evening, another man came, then another, not together, one at a time, quietly, without announcement, because admitting curiosity requires admitting uncertainty, and uncertainty is not something people display easily. Each of them asked different questions, about wood, about warmth, about construction. But all of those questions pointed to the same realization. Something here worked, differently. And difference, when everything else is failing, becomes something people can no longer ignore. Eliza did not try to convince them. She did not explain more than necessary. She answered only what they asked, and let the rest remain visible, because what they were seeing mattered more than anything she could say. And winter was not finished yet. It was only beginning to show them what they had built wrong. By the second week of cold, the problem was no longer subtle. It had moved past discomfort, past inconvenience, into something measurable, something that could not be ignored or explained away. Wood piles were no longer reserves.
They were timelines. Each log burned was no longer warmth. It was a calculation. How many days left? How many nights? How long before something ran out that could not be replaced? Louis Benton stood outside his cabin at dawn, staring at what remained of his stacked wood. It had been enough. By every estimate he had trusted. By every winter he had survived before. But this winter was not behaving like the others. Or perhaps it was, and he had never understood it properly. He had always assumed the cold came from outside, that walls and doors were the barrier, that fire was the answer. Now he understood something else. The cold did not arrive. It was already there, waiting beneath him, and it was taking more than he could afford to give. Inside, his wife had wrapped the children in every blanket they owned, not for comfort, for stability, to slow something that could not be stopped. He stepped back into the cabin and closed the door. The fire burned strong, but the room did not feel secure. It felt temporary, like holding heat in hands that could not close tightly enough to keep it. Across the settlement, the same realization was spreading. Not through conversation, through experience, through nights that did not warm, through mornings that began colder than the night before, through wood that disappeared faster than it should. And in the middle of that pattern, one place remained consistent: Eliza Markov's cabin. Smoke rose from it every morning, the same way, the same thickness, the same rhythm. Not the frantic burn of someone fighting loss, but the steady output of someone maintaining balance. People noticed. They did not speak about it openly, not yet, but they noticed. Henry Pike was the first to say it out loud, not as an admission, as an observation. At the general store, standing near the stove, he spoke without looking at anyone directly. "She's not burning as much wood." The statement hung in the air. No one responded immediately, because responding would require engaging with what the statement implied. Jeremiah Pike finally spoke. "Different land up there." Henry shook his head. "Land's the same." Jeremiah frowned. "Then what?" Henry did not answer right away, because the answer was already forming in his mind, and he did not like it. Not because it was complicated, because it required him to reconsider something he had dismissed. "The floor," he said finally. Jeremiah looked at him. "What about it?" Henry met his eyes. "It's not on the ground." Silence followed, not confusion, recognition trying to become acceptance. Jeremiah exhaled slowly. "That don't make sense." Henry nodded. "I know." And that was the problem. It did not match what they believed, but it matched what they were seeing. And when those two things conflict long enough, one of them has to change. By the 15th day of cold, the first cabin failed, not collapsed, not destroyed, failed in a quieter way. Thomas Hale's wood ran out, not completely, but enough that what remained could not sustain the fire through the night. He rationed it, reduced the burn, tried to stretch it, but the ground did not reduce its demand. It continued pulling heat the same way it always had, without adjustment, without pause, without concern for his supply. That night the fire burned low, too low. The room cooled faster than expected. The floor turned from cold to something sharper, something that moved upward more aggressively when the fire weakened. He did not sleep. He kept feeding small pieces into the fire, trying to maintain something that was already slipping. By morning, the decision had been made for him, not in words, in necessity. He wrapped his children, packed what little he could carry, and stepped outside. The cold hit immediately, but it was no worse than what he had already been enduring inside, because inside had stopped being shelter. He looked toward the ridge, toward the cabin he had already seen, the one that had not changed, and he started walking. He was not the only one. Others had reached the same point. Different cabins, different calculations. Same result. Something they had built was not enough, and there was one place that was. They did not move together. They did not organize. Each family made the decision independently, which made the pattern more meaningful. Because it was not influence, it was convergence. They arrived at different times, one family, then another, then two more before nightfall. Eliza opened the door each time, the same way, no surprise, no hesitation, just recognition, because she had expected this, not in detail, but in outcome. When you build something that works against a force others ignore, eventually that force makes the difference visible. The cabin filled slowly, not crowded, but full enough that the space changed, voices lower, movements more careful, people aware of each other in a way they had not been before, not as neighbors, as individuals sharing the same constraint. The fire burned in the center, steady, not overworked, not struggling. The heat spread evenly, held, maintained. People noticed immediately, not because it was warmer than their homes, because it was consistent. No cold pushing upward through the floor, no need to constantly adjust, no invisible loss undermining what they were trying to keep. Thomas Hale stood near the wall, looking down, then back up at Eliza. "You knew," he said. She shook her head slightly. "I understood." There was a difference. He nodded, because he felt that difference now, not as knowledge, as experience. Henry Pike arrived later that night. He stepped inside, paused, looked around, then looked at the floor, then back at Eliza. He did not ask a question, because he already knew the answer. He just had not accepted it before. Now he did, because the cost of not accepting it had become too high. Jeremiah Pike came last. He stood in the doorway longer than the others, not because he was uncertain, because he was adjusting, repositioning what he believed in relation to what he was seeing. He stepped inside slowly, closed the door behind him, and stood there, silent, for a long moment. Then he spoke. "You raised it for a reason." Eliza nodded. "Yes." He looked down again, then around the room, then back at her. "What else do we not understand?" That question settled into the space differently than the others, because it was not about the cabin. It was about everything they had assumed without examining. Eliza did not answer immediately, because the answer was not something she could give them directly. It was something they would have to arrive at the same way they had arrived here, through experience, through consequence, through seeing what worked and what did not. "Enough," she said finally. And that was sufficient, because winter was still ongoing, and it had not yet finished teaching them what it came to teach. By the time the cold began to loosen its grip, the settlement was no longer the same place it had been when winter started, not because the land had changed, because the people had. The snow still lay deep across the valley. The creek still moved slowly beneath its frozen skin. The air still held that sharp edge that reminded everyone winter was not finished yet. But something else had shifted beneath all of that, something quieter, more permanent. Inside Eliza Markov's cabin, the fire burned the same way it always had, steady, measured, enough. The people inside had adjusted to one another, not comfortably, not easily, but effectively. They had learned how to share space the way winter forces people to share it, without excess, without waste, without the illusion that comfort is something guaranteed. It was not just a shelter anymore, it was a system, and everyone inside it understood that, because they had felt the difference between this and what they had built for themselves. They had felt what happened when a structure ignored the conditions it existed in, and they had felt what happened when one responded to it correctly. The contrast had done what no explanation ever could. It had removed doubt. When the first signs of thaw appeared, they did not celebrate immediately because they understood something now that they had not understood before. Winter does not end suddenly. It releases slowly, carefully, and anyone who assumes it is finished too early pays for that mistake. So they waited. They watched. They let the ground soften before they trusted it, and when they finally began to return to their own land, they did not return the same way they had left. They returned with questions, not the kind that are spoken aloud, the kind that change behavior. Louis Benton was the first to begin again. He stood in the remains of his cabin and looked at the floor, then at the ground beneath it, then at the memory of a space that had not failed. He did not try to repair what was there, because repair would mean repeating the same mistake. Instead, he dismantled it, board by board, beam by beam, not with frustration, with intention. Because now he understood something he had never questioned before. The ground was not a foundation, not in winter, not in a place where cold defined survival. Henry Pike followed, then Thomas Hale, then others, not together, not organized. Each man working through the same realization in his own time, they began to dig. Not shallow, not quick, deep, measured. They set posts the way they had seen them set before, burned the ends, placed them carefully, raised platforms above the ground. At first it felt unfamiliar, wrong, like abandoning something that had always worked. But that feeling did not last, because they had already seen what worked better. And once a person sees something that works better, returning to what fails becomes difficult to justify. Eliza did not instruct them. She did not gather them or explain her method in full. She worked on her own repairs, reinforced what she had built, adjusted what winter had revealed. And they watched, not openly, but carefully, because now they understood the value of observation. The next winter did not arrive with the same violence. It did not need to. The lesson had already been delivered. When the cold returned, it found a different settlement, cabins raised above the ground, air between structure and soil. Wood burned more slowly, heat held longer. Families slept without waking to the same creeping cold beneath them. The difference was not dramatic. It was controlled, and that control changed everything. Jeremiah Pike stood outside his new cabin one evening as the first frost settled into the ground again. He looked at the structure, at the space beneath it, at something he would have mocked a year earlier. Then he nodded once, not to anyone else, to himself. Because understanding does not always arrive with words. Sometimes it arrives quietly and stays. If you have ever dismissed something too quickly, you already know how this ends. Not with an apology, not with an admission, but with a change. Because people do not always say they were wrong. They show it in what they build next, in what they refuse to repeat, in what they finally choose to understand. And in that settlement, when winter returned again and again in the years that followed, the cabins that stood above the ground did not stand out anymore. They became normal, expected, obvious. The laughter that once followed the idea disappeared completely, not because people remembered it, because they no longer recognized why it had ever been funny. And the cold, the same cold that had taken so much from them, remained exactly what it had always been, unchanged, unforgiving, but no longer misunderstood. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.